Well, I think we have a treat for everyone now. I think this is going to be a really, really great session. And one of the things that people said earlier, oh, by the way, I'm Andrea Mihalik from Plum Analytics and Elsevier, if I'm an unknown face here. But one of the things that people talked about a little bit earlier was the fact that metrics and Altmetrics really is about 7 years old. So I started thinking 7 years, what happened 7 years ago? And one of the things that happened was my oldest daughter was in 2nd grade, forgive this little interlude, and she had to do a school report on a US president, and it was either JFK or Nixon in that era. And as she pulled together her 2nd grader's PowerPoint, at the same time that all of these new metrics were being developed, she was able to have video of the inauguration. She was able to have all this rich media that was created at that time and embedded. And I remember thinking just how much this changes everything. From a very, an elementary school's report about a topic, and how modern day researchers now, when they're telling their story, how much richer information they have out there that they can embed and use that to communicate. So when we think about Altmetrics in this 4 a.m. conference, we're often thinking just about Altmetrics as other types of metrics about traditional research output like journal articles. But there's actually more different types of research outputs. Of course, data, which we haven't talked about much here, but folks who blog as a part of their research, people who are creating all different types of research outputs are a different type of alt, right? And as especially early career researchers are creating all of these different ways and experimenting with different ways to talk about what they do, why it's important, what they've learned, the impact it's had, they're moving more and more towards this. So our invited blogger today is Samantha Yammie from University of Toronto, and she does an absolutely fantastic job of communicating her research, what it means to others, as well as everyone in the audience watches what she does, she's also amazing at creating a personal brand around what she's doing. So both, whether you're a researcher, a librarian, a funder, whatever your kind of publisher, wherever your background is, I hope that you'll find this conversation and this topic really, really engaging and exciting.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I am new to this community, but really happy to be here today to talk to you about how I've been using social media in what I think are innovative ways to try to engage people with science and do really more modern science communication. So I come to you today not as an Altmetrics researcher, but as a biomedical researcher. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, where I study how stem cells build and can repair the brain. So I'm a neuroscientist and stem cell biologist. Now, when I say that to most people, their eyes kind of glaze over, and if you're my parents, the next day they're asking me, what is it that you study again? And I don't blame them. There's a bit of jargon in my research title. So I decided I need to find a better way to make what I do known to more people, a better way to describe it. And so instead of writing my job title, how you see it here, I've adopted this biography. If you can read it, this is what you would find on my bio on Instagram, where I go by the more catchy nickname Science Sam. So you'll see I call myself a PhD researcher and science storyteller. I began this Instagram account, Science Sam, about 1.5 years ago. And the reason was because I felt that we really needed more transparency between what's happening in research labs and transparency with what's happening there and to the public who's funding this through their tax dollars. The reason that I say this is because my field of research, stem cell biology, is very hot in the media right now, and I think it will continue to be. However, we see from this news title from just earlier this year that a lot of people are exploiting this hype of stem cell research. So here I'm showing you this article where it's reporting 3 people are nearly blind because they've had an unregulated direct-to-consumer stem cell treatment. And I'm putting that deliberately in quotes because these are not authorized treatments. And so it turns out that because stem cells and many areas of health research are so hyped in the media, people think, oh, there's a cure for me if I'm desperate and sick. and they go to these clinics that are not actually regulated and backed by research. If you think that this is a rare thing, it's not. And in fact, the biggest hotbed for these type of fake clinics is the US. That has about 27% of all of the clinics. And to me, that's terrifying. There are many countries, from the people in this audience might recognize their own country on this list. Germany's there, Canada's there, Australia, Mexico, Thailand, China. It's terrifying to me that these countries where you think there is good, and we know there is good quality biomedical research, they're still secretly somehow through these loopholes, these unregulated clinics that are offering very dangerous fake therapies to patients. So clearly, despite all of these wonderful tweets about science and all of these researchers online, I don't think we're doing enough. We are not being effective in accurately translating what we're doing at the bench to the people who need to know that information. And I think it's really interesting to talk about why we're not being effective. For me, digging into the more psychosocial research, we see that what's really important for communication is not only, if you're effectively communicating, you want to change attitudes of your audience. But attitudes is kind of, there's two parts to it. There's the cognitive side, your beliefs, your rationale, but there's also the emotional side, right? There's your feelings, and that's called your affect. And I think that a lot of scientists, we kind of play to more the cognitive side. We have this thinking, and I do too, of, well, this is true. Why don't you believe it? You are wrong. This is correct. And we find that truth, period, peer-reviewed research, you know, if it's backed by peer-reviewed research, it is correct. It must be taken into an attitude. That's not really the case. We're forgetting that other side of the equation. We're forgetting that emotional part that's really important for getting people to actually make change in the way that they behave. And this is not just applicable to health research. This is the same for climate science as well. So I think what we need to keep in mind is that yes, scientists, you know, we have the expertise, we have the truth behind us, but we also need to foster the trust, because that trust is going to play into more of that emotional side of that equation. That's going to give us really good communication. And so instead of showing you a meme now, I know this audience likes data, so I have a nice graph for you. This is research from Susan Fisk and Dupree from just a few years ago. And I don't know if I have a... Anyways, if you look at the lower right quadrant of this graph, the axes here are warmth on the y-axis and competence on the X. Now, warmth is kind of an output or surrogate metric for trust. People who find someone, if they'll rate them as warm, they'll likely trust them and think that they're someone who has good intentions. And what we find is that scientists fall into the same, that lower right quadrant where lawyers are found, whereby we're found to be we're perceived as very competent, but not very warm. And I think that's pretty problematic. Now, if we look at scientists in the popular media, I dug up who I think, and I looked at some, BuzzFeed lists, who are the most popular scientists, and you'll notice some familiar faces. On the left, we have kind of more robotic scientists, right? We have the Spock and Sheldon types. And then towards the right, I think Commander Hadfield is a great exception to many of the characters on this slide. I think he's very warm, and people like him and trust him. We have Dawkins, Bill Nye, Neil deGrasse, and then from Futurama, the professor. Well, a few things to note about this slide. Anything jump out to anyone? They're all men, and hi, I'm a scientist. So, yeah, one thing is there's a pretty strong diversity problem, and that's problematic for many reasons. One, for representation in science and inviting more people into conversations. It's also important because another way to foster trust is through relatability. And if half the population is female and we're only showing men, I mean, we're really excluding a lot of people from those conversations. Furthermore, beyond just the straight demographics, the way that they portray themselves, these kind of more robotic, very nerdy, eccentric, antisocial types, that's not really relatable either. And that's not someone I want to talk to. And if I read something controversial, I'm going to go to the Instagram celebrity who's really friendly, who's probably, disseminating misinformation over this person who's probably going to tell me I'm stupid or something, right? Not in the case of Sheldon Cooper. So when I look at these popular scientists, I don't see my friends. And I think that's a problem because my friends are real scientists doing real work. So I decided I needed to change that. I went to social media. I was already on Twitter and really enjoyed Twitter as a tool for sharing science. But I also knew that Instagram is very big and very popular. I didn't have Instagram at the time, but I was trying to decide between which platform I wanted to really take advantage of to try to change this conversation. Obvious differences between the two. We know the character limits are vastly different, even though Twitter might change that, but still, it will still be a lot less than you can fit on Instagram. I think it's not sure, whatever. It says 500 million tweets a day on Twitter, as opposed to 95 million posts per day on Instagram. So we have a big volume difference in terms of amount of information across either platforms. What's really interesting there is that there are way more, double monthly active users on Instagram compared to Twitter. So on Twitter, you have far fewer people talking a lot more. On Instagram, you have less people, but they are very actively engaged, and you have far more people on Instagram, and they're very actively engaged, and they're not posting as much, which means that the half-life of your post on Instagram is a lot longer. And given that you also have a lot more space to talk on Instagram, I thought that would be a fantastic tool. There are a bunch more reasons. I included this because I thought this audience might be more familiar with Twitter and less so with Instagram. So I included some more interesting metrics about Instagram here. What's important to me is, at least for the Canadian stat, the average Canadian will check Instagram 11 times a day. I check it way more than that. I'm also curious, how many people in this room have an Instagram account? And keep your hand up if you use it professionally. Okay. Interesting, yeah, so only a fraction of us. Most of us treat it as a highly social platform right now. But I think it's very interesting that since Canadians and this goes to all people, are checking it very frequently, this is a great avenue to making science something people are familiar with, people are being exposed to all the time, and kind of in my, one way to say it is to incept them with science. Don't let them know they're learning science, but just keep shoving it in their face. So this is what I've done. If you were to look at my Instagram profile today, this is what you would see. I have about 9,900 followers, which is exciting. It's been about a year and a half. What's more important to me than the number is that they're very engaged, and I'll show you some stats there. You'll see the different types of content I post just from this quick snapshot. I like to feature inspiring and underrepresented people in science. So in the top left, that's our new Chief Science Advisor in Canada, who I thought was a fantastic person to showcase. I do posts from the lab. If I'm looking through the microscope, I'll take a snapshot of what I'm looking at, share it, explain it. And then, of course, there are selfies here, because selfies are the language of Instagram. And I know that you might feel silly. I felt silly taking selfie videos from the front row today, but I know that that's important, and if I want people to read my message and read about science, I have to stick a face on it. I also think that those selfies are really important for building that trust when people can see who's behind this random account on Instagram. And I think we do that a bit less on Twitter. I think on Twitter we're just putting a lot of text, and it becomes impersonal. So when you stick your face on it, I think people are a little more compelled to pay attention and also be a little more respectful. So the core philosophies that I adhere to are up here. Basically, I don't want any hype or sensationalism. It's very important for me to showcase basic and fundamental science, not just this will cure you tomorrow, but more like, hey, do you know how an antibody works? It binds to a protein, it's fluorescent, we take a picture. So I like to show these things that we kind of think are boring and not exciting and try to make them exciting through visuals and fun analogies and language. I prefer to showcase the process of science, the rationale. What is science, philosophically, kind of, as opposed to just spitting science facts. People love facts, so I'll use them as a hook now and then, but I prefer to let them know, hey, this is what goes into a PhD. And I always try to never be condescending and try to always be open so that we can invite more people to the conversation. So I'll take something like what you see on the left, which is a research poster that I presented at an international conference earlier this year. I won't even read the title because it's not a very good one or exciting one, and I'll turn it into a post like this. The same information is being conveyed in this post, but obviously packaged in a really different way. So this was a kind of fun one, talking about stem cells. I used Wolverine as a pop culture reference. And this post did fairly well. It had 875 likes and a ton of engagement, a ton of comments, and I think that's really important to think of engagement and not just, likes. The other really cool thing about Instagram to me is that it offers these new interactive forms of communication that Twitter also has as well. There's the live stream function that was introduced sometime last year, and so using the live stream feature, on the left, that's a screenshot of me giving a live stream Q&A about a paper that was really controversial and highly publicized in the popular media. It was about human-pig chimeras. Did anyone hear about that paper? Yeah, so, all of the media were showing, pigs with human heads and all this. And there was a lot of fear in the rhetoric around this paper, but it was a stem cell paper that I could read and dissect as an expert. So I read it. I printed out the paper and I advertised a live stream where I'd do a Q&A. I took people through the paper in a live stream. I said, you see all this? This means this. No, they did not make a hybrid pig and human. Don't worry. Here's why they were doing that as well. And that was viewed by about 300 people, but at any given time, about 50. So one advantage to live streams on Instagram is that because people are more actively checking their accounts, they're more likely to tune into your live stream, which is great. On the right, I'm live streaming from a science outreach event. That way, when we do events that only about 50 people might be able to attend because of geography or whatnot, now we can spread it to a lot more people and make science and science outreach a lot more accessible, which is very important to me. And last, the really fun, my favorite part of Instagram is the story feature, which they copied from Snapchat unapologetically, and I'm happy that they did. This lets you post transient videos that will last only for 24 hours. So you can be really informal and candid and show what's happening every day. So I was filming some from this conference and telling people, hey, do you know what Altmetrics are? And so it's a really nice way to casually build relationships with people. And people love it. The biggest compliment I receive about my account is my stories, because I'll just be walking through the lab and talking about what I'm doing, and it's very personal. So you build these relationships in a high throughput manner, and people really feel like they know you because you're doing this. So it's really great for, again, building that trust. If you're wondering who my audience is, they're international. Even though I'm Canadian, most of my audience is in the US because sheer numbers, and we have people from all over the world actively engaging. Even people who, for whom English is not a first language, will still send me messages, and we find ways to communicate with pictures or broken English and Google Translate, and it's a lot of fun. This is on the left, I don't know, it might be difficult to see, but the demographics in terms of age. So the bulk of the followers are between the ages of 18 to 34 years old. So a lot of undergraduate students who want to become scientists, and a lot of my peers. I do have a ton of high school students who are highly engaged and will message me and ask for advice. So I would say that I've been successful reaching many people who are engaged, but I want to reach, in the future, fewer scientists and more people who aren't in science. But I think you always start with your in-group first, so I'm not too upset about that. And we have a pretty even male-female spread. Instagram is also skews more female, so this is actually quite balanced, and I'm happy about it. A few more numbers for you. So I told you I'm at about 9,900 followers. I think I'll be at 10K this weekend, which it's an exciting milestone for me. That translates to about 500,000 monthly impressions. So that means about any type of content that I put out is seen about 100 million times if you add them all together. That means only 35,000 unique people are seeing it. So many people, about 35,000, are seeing the content many times in 1 month. And again, I think that's actually a good thing and not a discouraging thing, because it means that people are constantly being reminded of what you're doing and constantly being incepted with science, which is great. If you add up the reach of all my followers, it's about 9 million. So that means if you're thinking about virality, there's really big potential in spreading information here if you kind of pass it down and think of it like a communication chain. Obviously, not everyone who views will share, but I think it just gives you a good metric of what your potential reach is. So the way that I get many more people seeing my content than following me is through being clever with the Instagram algorithm and using specific hashtags. And so I'm showing you here, these are all of the top posts for the hashtag stem cell, which I told you, sharing better information about stem cells is a big motive for me. So I'm very happy that at the time this was posted, it was the #1 recommended post for hashtag stem cell was mine in the top left. And many of the other top posts were, not quite as, what's the word, honest? I'll use that word. So I'm very happy to have penetrated in there. And if we look more at the metrics on that particular post, it was seen by about 19,000 unique users and 22,000 times in total. So that's, I think, very good for someone of my following, and it's, I would say, above average. And this is an example of a high-performing post. It's had about 1,000 engagements, and that includes saves and comments, likes, and shares as well. What's interesting, this is relatively easy to do, so you can get maybe 1 in every 4 or 5 posts, depending on how clever you are and how committed, you can get them having these types of metrics. On Twitter, I find it less common to have a post be seen that much, but when you do have that success, it's outstanding and can surpass the reach that you had on Instagram. So here's a snapshot of some quantitative stats from my Twitter account in the last month, where you'll see that I have a third of the followers on Twitter, but it's seen by many more, per person, the impressions are way higher, right? It's much easier to share because retweets are so embedded in Twitter use. So you can get your content seen much further. And a really well-performing post on Twitter can be seen by like 40,000 people, which I think is double what I see on Instagram, even with my best effort. So I think there's still a lot of value in Twitter. And in fact, that value comes more from link clicks. So if you're sharing, if you want someone to click on a link, I find that people will click links more likely from Twitter than from Instagram. So an example was a blog post I wrote on Medium, and I shared it through all my social networks. And here, because I used Bitly, I could track where the link clicks came from, and there were, the vast majority were from Twitter. And the Instagram didn't even make the little table of contents because I think it was clicked like 30 times. So right now, clicking external links is not common on Instagram, and I think that's going to change. But right now, there's a big difference in the utility of either platform. In that on Instagram, people mainly stay in the app, and on Twitter, they're very likely to leave the app. And that can be very useful depending on what you're trying to accomplish. For me, I'm very interested in not just the quantitative metrics, also the qualitative metrics. And so they're basically illegible here, but there are many stories, many cases where people will send kind messages that they learned something, that they found something inspiring, that they were going through a tough time and they enjoyed my sharing that I was going through a similar thing. So qualitatively, I think it's more difficult to assess impact, but these seem compelling anecdotally that you can make a lot of impact through this familiarity that you give people through a platform where you're being very personal and being very open with yourself. So some quick summaries here. I think Twitter is fantastic for sharing external content versus on Instagram, you can really do some great storytelling, really long form stories, and you get much better engagement on average on Instagram with internal content if you keep people on the app. And so I want to just finish with 2 examples, if that's okay for time, yeah? Okay, so 2 examples of actually the benefit of using these in conjunction. And I like to share things across both media and just tailor them for the given audience. And if I want someone to click a link, I'll put that on Twitter first before Instagram. Here's an example of a social movement that I started using these 2 media. So I was walking through the local drugstore and I saw a beauty ad that said, "Skip class, not concealer." Okay, so I took pictures and then I went home and angrily tweeted it, went to bed and woke up and it had been retweeted a bunch, which was great. I wasn't really sure. You can't really predict these things, so that was good. And then I cross-posted it on Instagram the next day. You'll see the aesthetics are a little bit different, tailoring for the audience. And I also could give more of a story on Instagram. Both of them were very well received. I have some quick metrics there for you. The Instagram post the impressions were far higher. It was about 100,000 because there were so many retweets, and that really lets you expand through networks. Versus on Instagram, the impression was 10,000, reach about 6,000. So you can really see the difference here. Like when a Twitter post does well, it does well. But it's more common to have them go well on Instagram. What you can't get here, and the limitation of trying to quantify things even in my rudimentary manner on Instagram, is when people reshare on Instagram, they're creating new content, and there's no built-in way to track that except if you count how many people use your hashtag. So I invited people to use the hashtag #SkipBenefitNotClass, share a story of when maybe they were discriminated against for wearing makeup but also being studious or something like that. And we had hundreds of people put pictures and submit pictures. It's hard to gather more data, and I think if there were a way to track that, I would know that I would see that the reach on Instagram was higher than I would have thought. But I think that what I care about more was that we were able to impact and start this nice movement and bringing people together through selfies on social media, something that we look at as kind of a stupid thing to do, right? If you see someone doing this, you probably roll your eyes, right? People do it to me all the time. Yet we were sharing an important message, and there were many people saying like, yeah, you know, I didn't apply for this scholarship because I didn't think I'd get it because I was treated this way for looking this way. And anyways, you can get really, really important messages out in this manner. The last thing, while I feel that this has been very impactful, I am a scientist, I want to know if it actually is impactful. So I've teamed up with a group of scientists from the United States. We all have met through social media, and we started this project. It's the Scientists Who Selfie project. We crowdfunded, and in 3 weeks, we raised $10,000 US, and we're going to be studying whether we're actually right and our hunches are right, and that whether sharing selfies on Instagram is actually doing anything beneficial for scientists, or is it all just fun? And so the study is going to look like this. We're going to show something sciencey, then we're going to show a selfie or a picture of a scientist who's female with that sciencey thing, and then we're going to do the same thing with a male, and we're going to get people, if the captions are all the same, we're going to get them to rate how trustworthy, warm, and competent did you find the scientist behind the post in each case. So we're going to look at gender differences, we're going to look at this warmth statistic, whether selfies really give more warmth. And I think it's going to be a really interesting way to see whether what we're doing is actually quantitatively impactful. And if you're interested in that, there's the bit.ly link. It's Instagram pilot, or you can reach out to me. So I thank you so much for your attention. I think this is a very exciting and new form of science communication. The metrics, as you could see, especially coming from someone like me, are very rudimentary, but I'm very excited to hear about ways to quantify this more and show that, and test whether this actually has the value that it seems to be having on an anecdotal basis. So I'd love to chat more if we have time for questions, and also I'm very reachable online through any of these streams. Yes, I'm very Googleable. And I'll be sharing my slides through a tweet as well. Thank you.
We have just a bit of time for questions. We have a question. Yeah, go ahead.
Questions and criticisms, I welcome them all.
Hi, Joe Wells, Crossref.
Hi.
Everything I know about Instagram I learned here, so I know nothing about this.
Cool.
One of the interesting things that came up yesterday was if you incentivize use of social media,
Yeah.
and women are harassed on social media, those two things don't really go together well. Mm-hmm. And it seems like a medium based around selfies would have all kinds of, first of all, you're more
Yes.
public, but also the factors like body image and people not feeling comfortable. And do you feel like that skews things? And do you know people doing the same thing? And have you got any observations?
It's a great point. I think that not everyone's going to be comfortable communicating with selfies, and I also don't think that's the only way that we need to communicate. I think it's one of many ways. We try to be a very inclusive community, and I have built this community of scientists now on social media. If you go on Instagram, there are tons of people doing similar things. And I think we're very positive, and you get a good diversity of people chatting there, and you're getting the people who otherwise don't have platforms on which to speak. I don't think it's going to be right for everyone, and I do think that it will come with a bit of backlash, like, oh, you're not an authority, you're just some girl who takes selfies. So I really do try to balance it with very high quality captions, and I also think the value of showing it in multiple ways. So I'm showing that I'm in the lab researching what I'm critiquing and evaluating. So that makes it harder for someone to discredit me. But I've faced a lot of harassment on Twitter, so yeah, you're right. It's going to be a balance, yeah.
Camilla from Sweden.
Hi.
How do you deal with the time issue? Like if followers want a response immediately, or if there's a controversy and there will be like a storm, Twitter storm or anything like this, how do you?
Yeah, time in general has been a challenge because I am trying to, finish my degree as well. Usually I'll be on my Instagram on breaks, and I have a lot of breaks in my schedule, and my schedule in the lab is quite flexible. So that's kind of fortunate. I have to do all of my posting at noon because that's when it gets the best reception, so I can schedule my experiments around that. But I would say that I can do, because there's different types of media to do, so if for example, when the Google memo came out, I wanted to that Google manifesto that was quite sexist, I wanted to comment on that. I didn't have time to make a formal post. I did a quick comment in a story video, and then a post followed a few days later when I had time. So you can just layer different types of media. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
it is a challenge, though.
Thank you for a very inspiring talk. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Great. Do we have one last question? Go ahead.
Just kind of following up on the time question, if you had to choose between doing your own original research and being this more, or more of the social media person, all things considered, would you think that you would have more of an impact as an original researcher or as a social media proponent a la Bill Nye or something like that?
Yes, so I have about a year left of my PhD, and after that I want to do this full time, and I have received feedback, unfortunately, from a lot of my mentors saying, well, maybe you'll lose your credibility. I don't think I will, because I think I will stay on top of the research and still go to academic conferences, and I think that that will be important. But if you look at the main science communicators right now, they often, even the YouTube celebrities, they don't have formal training in what they talk about. And I think they're still able to maintain authority, and I think because I am a young female sharing via selfies, I'll need to really play that up. And so I'll continue to go to conferences to kind of compensate and show people that I'm doing that, so that, again, you have to really bear the burden of proof, but I'll do it for the sake of it.
Great. Well, thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thanks.
The next session is coming up, right? Everyone has noticed we changed the schedule, I'm sure. Lunch already happened. I'll give you a little. There we go.
All right, hello everyone. I'm Madi Watson from Crossref. Today we have a session that's all about the social side of Altmetrics. So it's kind of good timing coming after that amazing presentation that we just had. We have 4 speakers here up with us who all have done some work into the societal impacts, both of looking at some of the, I guess, the challenges and opportunities that need to be considered when we're both talking about altmetrics and when we're actually using them as a measure of impact. We can take questions after each person, I think. We have got Juan Pablo Alperin, who is presenting from opportune indicators to narratives, conceptualizing altmetrics for social impact. I think you're presenting on behalf of Katherine Reilly as well, both from Fraser University.
Thank you. This is about a year ago, a year and a half ago, I received a grant to be able to study the societal impact of research by looking at social media. And at that time, the very first question, as soon as we got the grant, was how are we going to define societal impact? Because it's something that we, in the Altmetrics community, I feel have always been a bit aspirational about the fact that these metrics are going to be useful for this purpose. But we have not necessarily come to terms with what exactly that term means. So one of the first things that we did, and this is what I'm presenting here, has been a result of conversations with one of the co-PIs on the project, Katherine Reilly, who's a communications professor at Fraser University, and who I believe is tuning in. So hi, Katherine. And I wanted to, we sort of started having conversations about how we were going to operationalize this idea of societal impact. And for that, we wanted to start having a bit of a theory about how are we going to think about what societal impact means in the context of trying to create metrics and indicators for this work. And so I realized there's been actually over the last, just yesterday and earlier today, we've had different people presenting frameworks and sort of how to go about thinking about metrics. And so in some sense, this is in that same vein of trying to propose a way of thinking about what it is that we're doing when we're trying to create our metrics and when we talk about them. And one of the goals that I think I want to try to achieve over the next 15 minutes is to start giving us some terminologies and some way of talking about this that is a little different than what I think this community has been doing over the last several years. So hopefully we'll be able to get to that point as I sort of walk through what our thinking, where our thinking has taken us. First, starting from what was sort of the theme of the workshop that we had leading up to this, and what we also started with this idea of opportune indicators, is that, we have been working from this frame of what it is that we have available to us. And there's all kinds of questions that we kind of ignore, or that I think we're starting to finally raise, and maybe we ignored in the earlier years of Altmetrics, and now we're finally starting to come to terms with. And I think this conference has been a good example of how we're starting to turn that narrative, and I just want to contribute to that. Why is it that we count retweets, but on Facebook, we're not counting the number of times things have been sort of reshared. We count only a sort of original post and one. Why is it that we don't count any second order events? Right? Why aren't we counting how many times a post that was shared was liked on Twitter or on Facebook, or how many times it was commented on these other platforms, right? Why is it that we are counting primarily from sources that have English language content? Right? And the answer to these questions is because these are the things that are easy to count. And I think that what we were trying to figure out is like, okay, well, we know that we have a limited set of things available to us. And so we can't just be looking at all of them as if they are equal, because there's definitely some bias here in terms of what's become available. And so we need to start thinking about what are these metrics actually for, and how are we going to think about how to use them. I want to take a step back, and because we use the term metrics, I mean, it's in the title of the conference, and I think, like Jason pointed out, it wouldn't be a good Altmetrics conference if we didn't start talking about why Altmetrics and should it have a different name and challenging it. But the term metrics is an important one because we're using it over and over again. And I want to sort of talk about the two things that come out before the metrics exist and after the metrics exist, right? We moved from first having traces of things, and we have had metrics and indicators in all kinds of fields, in all kinds of ways before the technological era. I think one of the examples we've been sort of thinking about is like in archaeology, we have, you might find, people, in other past civilizations might have left seeds or artifacts or things behind results of what it is that they were doing, a part of their activities. They left some trace of something behind. And then archaeologists will go and dig up, and they'll finding seeds, and they're going to count, okay, well, we found this many seeds on this layer of the soil, and then then on this other layer, we found this many others, and we can start counting and having an abstraction from what that original trace was, and we have that we start counting, and this is one layer of abstraction that we have from the activity. Right? We then might have more complex measures around these things. It's like how have those counts changed over time, and there's another metric, right? Or what is the density of how close together they were, and that might become another metric. So we start having all of these different quantifications of these traces. And then we go from there, and we start thinking, well, now we sometimes try to tie back those two things, and we're like, we have these metrics. What do they tell us about the behavior that led to the traces in the first place? Or we might want to what are the indicators of when it comes to something else entirely? Which leads us to the question of both what is a good indicator once we abstract the traces into metrics, and then we have taken those metrics and start wanting to use them as indicators. What is it that we're actually wanting to have indicators for? Right? And because now we need to think of, are these metrics actually pointing to something in particular? That's just a misplaced slide that we're jumping over. There's 2 indicators for, and in this community, we have 2 main stories of what it is that we want indicators for. And there's obviously many other things that we could want indicators for, where we seem to primarily focus in our conversations here, stories of productivity, and tied into that are stories about quality, right? And stories of impact, in which, again, quality comes into play. And those are the 2 things, and if you were to do some kind of a content analysis of all of the talks that have been up here today, and all the conversations happening in the room, we could come up with a metric of the number of times that the word impact was measured, and we might think that that's an indicator of how important this community thinks impact actually is, right? And so if we want to think about impact, we have to realize that there is, in the same sense and the same vein of having things move forward, we have the outputs, right? That we are the things that are the traces that we're leaving behind of our scholarship. And then there's the things that happen that we're able to count, right? So the material ends up getting discussed. There's some outcome. Something happens with that output, right? It turns out that we are able to quantify some of those things, right? We can quantify how many times certain activities happen, but for every output, hopefully there's some kind of outcome, and then there's some kind of an impact. Again, and I'm going to leave that in sort of an abstract sense for now, but I'm going to come back to this word about how we think about what this impact is. But there's many problems with this sort of model, right? If we think about what we go from our research outputs, and as things happen towards, as we get towards something that's an impact. First, as you noticed, I picked it sort of in that triangle, said there's a diminishing number of things that we can look at. There's a lot of outputs, right? And then the number of things that we can consider to have impact is smaller, and the things that are then measurable in between, or the outcomes that we can observe, are reduced. But there's one truth is that many outputs don't have any outcomes whatsoever. And even if they have actual identifiable outcomes, the quote-unquote real-world impacts are actually often unclear, right? And this is a question that I think everyone here is familiar with. There is often, if there is a relationship between the output and the impact, however that's defined, there's the direct causal link of those 2 things is often actually quite difficult to demonstrate. Most typically, actually, we don't have an individual publication or a particular output have an impact. Normally, it's, it might take a really long period of time, or might come about through a very complex set of factors of which that output was a part. Or usually, actually, it's a combination of very many different outputs that, taken together, have actually led to an impact, which makes it so much more difficult for us to try to conceptualize what does it mean for any individual output, and how do we think of its role within this aggregate place? And the truth is that as we continue to generate new metrics, we realize that metrics really only have value once they become an indicator of a particular type of impact. And here is the word particular here is important, because then we have to really start thinking about what are the ways in which we can try to take this complex picture. What are the things that we can actually, that we can see are the outcomes of some of the things that people are producing? What are the kinds of impacts that we might be interested in? And then try to make those linkages between the 2. And here's where sort of our contribution, and this is, again, much credit here to Katherine for this categorization of being able to take my ramblings in the office and turning them into something a little more systematic, is to be able to help to think about how might we bound the problem of how we think about what are the actual things that we are looking at. And we start thinking of 3 different sort of kinds of impact that we might be thinking about. And this idea of bounding the problem, its usefulness is that it helps us to narrow down what it is that we're actually looking for. Talking about societal impact in those terms is not very helpful, because it doesn't help us to narrow down which are the metrics that might end up being indicators for that particular type of impact. And so we propose this idea of narrowing down how we bound the problem into 3 different categories. One are the epistemic contributions, right? Has these output, has this research had an impact in how we think about a particular topic? So it's the contributions to knowledge, the contributions to the kinds of which conversations we're having, which problems we're studying, or in the sort of a paradigm shifting kind of way. These things have had an impact, and then now we conceive of problems in a different way. The second is a very much more around targeted against a particular kind of problem. So here, has this research solved a problem? And these problems obviously can be there's an infinite number of different problems that we might be interested in saying. We propose that in order to talk about metrics and indicators, we need to start thinking, what is this research contribution to solving a particular problem? And being able to both specify that this is the kind of impact we want, and what is the type of problem that we're interested in. And the third one, which I think was actually quite nicely highlighted today with Fareshta's example of the research on the copper, and it was the nanotubes, is around what are the impacts on the accountability of science, or how is it that we think, or what are the attitudes that we have towards a topic. In that example, right, we had research that has clearly had an impact on how is very highly viewed by the public, probably in a way that's giving the public a negative perception of science, right? So it's having an impact in what are the attitudes towards either research as an enterprise or a particular research topic. And so this is different from the thinking about the topic and what we know, and this is an accountability in terms of how it is that this research is perceived or taken. And I was kind of encouraged by listening to some of the other frameworks or ideas that were being proposed today, is that I could kind of fit each of those frameworks into being a subset of one of these three categories, which I think was a nice sort of validation that at least these categorizations talk, although this is something we're just starting to put out there and we would love to have some more feedback on. Let me just conclude in the last minute or so a little bit about how this might work in practice. And again, we see that Altmetrics, the way it's talked about most frequently is in the context of research evaluation. Something that has frustrated me since the very beginning, and in fact this whole project is sort of born out of the frustration from wanting to move Altmetrics away from being used purely for assessing researchers in this, under the productivity frame, right? But one of the places I started, because this was it, I started by doing a literature review, or having someone helping with a literature review around all of the different kinds of research evaluation frameworks. Because that was the first place, was, well, are all these different people thinking about what is the impact of their work? Research assessment frameworks tend to sort of focus on different, as we see across the different frameworks, we find some worried about behavioral change, right? Some are very concerned about how the research contributes to innovation, right? Or some are very interested in things related to policy changes, different kinds of outcomes and different kinds of impacts that research evaluation tends to have. And so we would start to think about talking about the metrics and the indicators in ways that say, well, if what we're interested in is an impact that has to do with behavioral change, then what are actual indicators of behavioral change? That might point us towards looking at greater levels of discussion around new sets of topics, or the themes coming up in discussions being different than what they were before. That might be something that points to some kind of a behavioral change. Things that would then need to be validated with some studies of whether the behavior actually changed, right? But we would want to start looking in places which indicators make sense for thinking about behavioral change. There's a very popular framework called the CIAMPI framework that is looking at doing research assessment from the perspective of looking at innovation, looking for innovation, saying that the majority of innovation happens when there's productive interactions between different stakeholders, right? Between researchers and people in industry, researchers and each other. And so then, if that's what we're interested in, well, then that tells us that, indicators of certain kinds of actual interaction and network effects, and looking for new linkages in the metrics, that might be something that can tell you a productive interaction, or an interaction happened, and then we would maybe try to see, could we tell if it was productive according to how the framework thinks about it. And if we're interested in policy changes, well, then maybe metrics around mentions within policy documents, that's a logical metric, but looking at places elsewhere doesn't really make so much sense. So just to wrap up, I think this is what we're trying to do with this sort of framing piece was first for ourselves, but also for the community, to give us the kind of language of, and to help us to narrow down and focus in on what it is that we actually want to talk about, to get away from these very generic metrics for societal impact and start narrowing it down for metrics for solving this particular problem or metrics for generating these kind of epistemic outcomes. If we can try to work, and this is where I'm now, the next step will be to figure out how to take these ideas and get the conversations around Altmetrics to change and start using, if not necessarily this framing, something that takes into account some of these concerns and ideas. I think that as a community and as people that would like to benefit in some way from these metrics will be better off. Thank you.
Any questions?
Thank you very much, Juan. I fully agree with all you said, and I think that's the way to go. Perhaps for me, the problem that I encounter most of the time is that, in a way, what we are trying to do is to measure, to evaluate vague concepts. Because even a concept like scientific impact, we still have a lot of debates if citations provide a good measure for scientific impact. So going to broader concepts like societal impact or innovation is always more complicated. So I would like to get your views on how can we solve that issue.
I mean, I think that's exactly sort of where we started, right? Where when we were able to, I mean, to the point where we were able to write a grant and get funding using these terms around saying societal impact, using these vague terms that are ill-defined. But then it came time for saying we're going to do empirical work. We need to operationalize it. And then it's like, well, we need a good, which of these different vague concepts are we going to latch onto? Where we landed is at this point of saying, we can't work, you can't try to do this work in a generic way. We can't talk about it even in a generic way. We need to bound the problem into trying to think about its impact towards this particular kind of, working towards this particular kind of impact. And then you can't have an indicator of societal impact. Like that doesn't make sense as a concept. Even though we can talk about it in those ways, and we can talk about in this generic alternative metrics are useful as indicators of societal impact, we go from one very vague, nebulous thing to another, and that mapping, I don't think we're ever going to succeed at doing that. I think we propose this idea of sort of like narrowing in on saying it's an indicator of this kind of behavior, it's an indicator of this kind of an impact, and I think there we can have a much more productive conversation, and we can start doing work around creating metrics and indicators that can actually be useful for measuring things that many people out in the world are interested in measuring. And those might vary. The same indicators, the same metrics can be indicators of very different things. And they just need to be applied in some way, or you might need to filter them or manipulate them in different ways, depending on what you want to do. And until we get away from these vague concepts, I don't think we're going to get anywhere in terms of having some legitimacy for the work that we're trying to do. Okay. Yeah.
You're saying that in some ways there's an argument for being able to align one specific metric or indicator to a specific outcome, but equally you recognise that there might be several outcomes that can come out of one metric. Does that mean that we need to start from a place where we're very specific about the outcome before we choose which metric we're going to use, and we don't try to repurpose a metric just because we're able to get that data?
So, I mean, what we see in the research evaluation frameworks that we looked at, and this is a fairly, we look broadly at across a few of these indicators, that they do talk about, and when you look at, the CIAMPI framework, they're very specific about saying that they're really looking for innovation, right? So they predetermine this is the impact that this framework is useful for measuring. And the whole framework is structured around this idea. And then they say, we think that an indicator of innovation is productive interactions. And then we have the task to say, well, can we try to, if we're going to adopt this as a way of thinking about this is the impact we want, and this is the framework that we believe is a good framework, and this is a useful indicator, okay, out of the data, out of the things that we can make metrics out of, are any of these metrics indicators of the thing that we think is what we actually want the impact to be. And so there's we do need to a priori determine what it is that we value. This is what I really like about the humane metrics framework, where I think it still fits very much into this, because it's determining. Now that framework, from what I understood, is proposing this idea of we're going to have certain values that we want to look for, and we want to see the impact or the research or evidence of in the research that those values are being embodied. And so we need to determine those. In that case, the impact is having those values or having more of those values. And I think then we can take the step backwards and say, well, what are indicators of those values? And so I think that this is the idea is that we do need to know what it is that we want to measure, and the more specific we can be about this is the thing we're looking for, the better we can try to find indicators and metrics to go along with it. It's not an easy job, but I think until we change the narrative around how we talk about these things, we're not even trying to do that job. And then we can't succeed if we're not actually trying. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next up, we have Tierney Oliveira from the Federal Fluminense University, speaking about reputation analysis for Brazilian researchers. Just get your presentation up. Yeah.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I am Thaiana Oliveira from Federal Fluminense University. First of all, I think it's important to say that I am really newly in this field. I started this research just a few months ago. So I don't have results to show for us, but I have a lot of questions, and it's an opportunity to discuss these questions with you. Presenting my university, it's an important university of the state of Rio de Janeiro. It's considered 9th place in ranking of Center of World University ranking. It has 18,000 of students, 4,000 of teachers, of which 1,800 are postgraduate professors. For this research, it's important to introduce the context. 421 Brazilian scientific journals are in Scopus and 128 in Web of Science, among 10,000 of journals, Brazilian journals. So my question is, where is the rest of these journals? What is the quality, and where the researchers are publicating? So we are interested in understand this circulation of these scientific productions of the Brazilians, but before to understand where these journals are circulating, it's necessary to understand the ecosystem of the journal, the scientific ecosystem. It's necessary to recognize different agents and their circuits, and how they interact with others, and how it influences in our scientific publication. So our proposal is to understand the social, cultural, and psychological elements of each group, using alternative data sources and mixed methodologies. And it's important to show that these agents are not separately. They are integrated with each other, and we want to show, I want to show it how they integrate and how these circuits influence the scientific ecosystem. First of all, talking about the relation to our policies. our policies are organized by the funding agencies, the main funding agents. CAPES is one of them. It's a national agency vinculated to the Ministry of Education in Brazil, and it delimited our policies and how we can understand the quality of our system, publication system. I bring this table from Juan, an important reference to my research. It's a pleasure to be here sharing this roundtable with you. Is there different ways to evaluate the scientific publication in Brazil between the areas? Some consider the natural areas use the JCR indicators to measure the quality of the publication, but some fields like humanities, linguistics, and arts use other types of elements to evaluate the scientific quality of the publication. One of them is the title of the authors. If the journal publish 90% of PhDs and professors of postgraduate program, it is considered a high quality journal. So we know it's not enough to understand the quality of the journal, of course. So I am trying to understand the effect of these policies. In this case, analyzes the researches of my institution. I perceived that the researchers from natural areas tend to spread more their publication internationally, and the humanities, as it has a focus on the title and the other elements, tends to be more closely, more limited to the constructions of reputation between their peers, between the PhD students and colleagues of the department and colleagues of the field. This kind of policies has some consequences, like the research, the journals in natural. It's not common to have journals in natural science, but in humanities there are a lot of journals. So we are perceiving that this dynamic, social dynamics caused by the policies, and look into the policies and the communication, the actor communications and the actor of scientific policies, we are perceiving some changes. One of these main publisher basis is Cielo. It's an important basis for Latin America. One of the criteria of this to be indexed in this basis is have a profile in social media as a marketing, scientific marketing. So we think that this kind of social dynamics occurring through the policies and the communications will stimulate will change our policies in a few years, maybe 2 or 3 years. Maybe the participation and the engagement in social media will be included in our policies. But it's necessary to understand that the consequences of it now has been more interest of the researcher and the editors to be in social media. There are a lot of journals creating profile in Facebook, the most important social networks for Brazil. But there are no planning. There's no planning for this kind of insertion in social media. So it's very common to see pages in Facebook with no content and with no engagement. So we are trying to think about it, how we can plan strategic communication for this journal and improve engagement in social networks. And it's necessary to recognize that there are differences between the fields. Through a research that I made with our researchers, we see that academia.edu, it's the most used social network by the researchers of humanity. ResearchGate is most used by Health, Earth, and Access Studies, and Facebook is the most used in all fields. But when we return to the Cielo the system, the Cielo recommendation, they put more visibility to Twitter. But our research don't use Twitter commonly. So it's necessary to understand this difference between the field and the usage and the consumption in social media before planning strategic communication for our scholarly. Just to make an example, I also coordinated 41 journals in my institutions of all fields. And we are trying to activate the YouTube platform because it's important platform, and it's been very common to the young researchers. It's a very important platform to communicate. So I tried, there is no initiative to use YouTube in my institution. We are starting now planning to activate this platform, but I needed to map the interactions in this platform, not just looking to the metric, but looking how the social dynamics occurs. So I made some research, some search with the words divulgation, scientific divulgation, and we found different actors, not just the universities or journalists or as people who are integrated with this scientific system, but we also find different actors like commonly people, citizens, teenagers and adults, YouTubers, digital influencers, religion representatives, and other channels trying to use innovative languages. But there are other ways to communicate and construct the reputation in scientific circuits. In Brazil, we use this platform. It's a database of the curriculum. It's the way we present ourselves to the community. So we started this research to understand, trying to understand how the research constructed their reputation and how they communicate for the peers and other audiences. As this platform is open, anyone can access it. So we developed two methodologies for this. One is a content analysis of the abstract of this curriculum, because this abstract is an important space of the profile where we can put the mainly informations, the relevant informations to present themselves, and extraction information, extracting data from the whole curriculum. It's my corpus. I am now, to understand this complex scientific ecosystem, we choose look for the local scope and then broaden next to create some questions and relevant issues to research. We separated 132 researchers of UFI who are considered renowned, in other words, who received funding for the mainly agencies in Brazil, using different methodologies and different procedures. I will not present our corpus because it's very specific of our comprehension, Brazilian comprehension. Looking to the data, we found some relevant informations like the density of the research between 40 and 60 papers, and after 8 papers they declined the productions, the difference between areas, between fields, and other information. The language, it's the important to understand this ecosystem and the social dynamics in these ecosystems, because it's very commonly to publish our research in Portuguese in some areas, in some fields. In the others, there are, due to the policies that I said earlier, it's commonly, it's normally to publish in English in older journals, not in national journals, but in international journals. So it's important to know these cultural elements which influence the social dynamics in this ecosystem, scientific ecosystem. Another element that it's very important to understand, to know, it's the political and the economical. Looking at our corpus, we saw a decline in publication to 2014 till today, and coincidentally, it's the same period when we suffering a lot of cuts in investment, in research, in scientific research. So to understand this system, we have to comprehend all these elements. So, of course, it's impossible to say if there is a relationship, as my corpus is small, it's just a local, but it could be some kind of influence in the political and economical investment in our publication. More about the content analysis of the LATs, of the abstract and LATs. We identified that some researchers mention the postdoc, but just when the postdoc is in other countries. When the postdoc is in the own country, they didn't mention it in the LATs. So we can think about it, because there are a lot of cultural discussion about the how Brazilians see themselves and how they understand themselves as a country which was colonized. So it's relevant for us, this cultural information. And other elements which the researchers cited in the abstract of the curriculum is the international collaboration, H-index, ad hoc, and some other questions. And now look into another actor, Okay. Another actor is the Innovation and Patent System. Sorry for the automatic translator in patent. Looking to our research, we saw some fields is doing registering patents, and we started an interview with them with this research. They mentioned the social impact, the resolving problems, money, to be immersed in different circuits beyond academy, protections of the research. But when we look for the early career and PhD student, we saw the integration again of these actors of the ecosystems, the scientific ecosystem. I bring a phrase of the PhD student saying that she can't publish with in high impact journals, do she work and research at the same time. So as our policies based on innovative system incentive some fields to deposit patent, they prefer to make the deposit and get the PhD. So everything is connected. So it's important not to look only the metrics and only the data, but understand all the social dynamics in this ecosystem before then look to the metrics, look to the engagement, and look the other things relevant for our questions. So to understand the whole ecosystem, it's necessary to look through data and beyond data. It's necessary to bring context, social and political information, cultural and psychological elements, recognizing the difference between fields. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tierney. Do you have any questions? No? Perhaps afterwards. I'm just going to do a quick technical change here. Hold on. So up next, we have Ali Versluis from University of Guelph and Lillian Rigling from University of Western Ontario, who are presenting how we can tell a different story about Altmetrics.
You guys are going to have to deal with the same thing from yesterday, and where we like madly try and rejig the screen here so we can see our notes. We've also set a timer here, so we're going to try really hard not to go over the 15-minute mark. We know that folks are getting a little... There we go. Got it. Okay, so before we get started, we really just wanted to give a big shout out to our colleague Sarah, who unfortunately couldn't make it to the event today. She collaborated with us a lot on this presentation, and she really helped shape the content and the context. So even though she's missing from the stage, she's still very much here in our hearts. So we just wanted to give her a shout out. Okay, so before we get too much into things, we also wanted to give you a bit of an introduction to ourselves. So this is really so you understand a little bit more about where we're coming from and why we're interested in this. So all three of us are some flavor of scholarly communication librarians, essentially meaning that we work a lot with faculty, students, and other researchers on our campus on various aspects of the scholarly communications process. So this often involves providing individual and group instruction on things like publishing open access, understanding copyright, moral rights, licensing, all that good, sexy stuff, managing data and other non-traditional scholarship, and of course, measuring research impact, what we're here to talk about. So we do a lot of hand-holding, a lot of managing of emotions, and a lot of advocacy work, both within our own libraries and within larger university communities. So all of this is really to say that we've learned a few things over the years. And one of the things that we've learned is the importance of meeting users where they are. This means acknowledging their circumstances, respecting their boundaries, and allowing them to take ownership of the learning process. This has specific implications for research performance and evaluation. As we all know, H indices and citation counts are convenient, established measures of impact. They're readily understood by the academy, but as we also know, those measurements are seriously flawed. So enter Altmetrics, a way to glean more context about a piece of research based on its performance in the digital environment. But just like traditional metrics, Altmetrics have issues. They aren't the end-all be-all. There's still a lot of resistance to even the idea of Altmetrics, let alone their practical application. We think this is primarily due to the idea that value does not equal utility. So just because something is good doesn't necessarily mean that it's useful. So as librarians, the thing that we tend to notice the most when we work with researchers is this idea of effective resistance. We tend to notice this a lot firsthand when we're teaching workshops about research impact and online scholarly identities, things like that, because there's just a lot of noise around altmetrics and sometimes not enough of a convincing argument. So often this resistance originates from conversations with an advisor or more senior colleagues who tend to kind of hold strong to those traditional measures of impact. Altmetrics may also be a harder sell for graduate students and early career researchers specifically because they may not be as familiar with some of the academic norms and mores. So for example, graduate students may not be thinking about knowledge mobilization or the demonstration of the broader impact of their research that tend to be required by funding applications and granting agencies. They may not even see their research as particularly important or interesting, and thus are skeptical that those outside the academy will engage with it. Yet, as librarians, we do occupy a unique role. We are generalists with expertise. So although we're kind of disciplinary neutral in that our subject-based expertise, library and information science, is a bit of a hodgepodge, but what we do have is an in-depth knowledge of altmetrics and research impact. So this role really allows us to approach conversations with new scholars in an open way. So really approaching these conversations as partners. This is a different relationship than a researcher might have with their advisor or their colleagues, who again, by virtue of being kind of more senior in their career, still might hold strong to those kind of more traditional metrics. Basically, what we're saying is being a generalist is helpful when you're working with folks who are altmetric beginners. We're experts in the process of walking ourselves through a tool or an idea. We do it every day, all the time, for all of these things that we don't understand. And there's a lot of it. But we can do the same thing when we help folks work through the kind of emotional, affective sides of understanding, assessing, and quantifying. So I'm going to pass it over to Lillian, and she'll talk a little bit more about what this can look like.
Thanks, Allie. So when we put this together, the three of us sat down in a room. We all have worked at different institutions, and we've all run into the same sort of barriers when encouraging people to adopt altmetrics. We really, obviously, are big advocates, but we felt like we're running up against a wall. And while much of the perceived hesitation around the adoption of altmetrics seems to focus on reward structures, specifically, we get a lot of comments that say, you know, there's not value for non-citation-based metrics in the promotion and tenure process. My supervisor doesn't value it, the P&T committee doesn't value it, my university doesn't value it, my discipline doesn't value it. We found that if we dug a little deeper, there were some other reasons beyond that. You can unpack that statement and find sort of a complex system of barriers between a researcher and their willingness to measure their own impact in this sort of way. So what we're proposing is a model of 3 complex categorical barriers to adopting altmetrics, both to consider for librarians when advocating that people or departments or committees start to use these tools to value work, but also to think about when we think about is there really utility in the tools that we already have, and what can we add to that utility in the future? So addressing these barriers they're on the screen, sorry. Educational barriers, technical barriers, and cultural barriers. And addressing these at their roots can lead to more effective advocacy for altmetric use. So when we say educational barriers, we're talking about things that come from a knowledge gap that prevent the discovery or understanding of altmetrics. Perhaps a researcher has never heard of the concept of altmetrics or any specific tool, but this barrier is beyond the barrier of awareness. We can't just tell someone, we would love to be able to tell somebody that something exists and have them say, great, we're going to use it now. There are so many times that I have gone into a classroom or meeting to discuss alternative ways of measuring research impact beyond the H-index, only to be peppered with questions that I don't honestly have felt underprepared to answer. So unlike traditional citation metrics, where when a researcher is introduced to newer metrics, they tend to have a lot of questions about, like, how does this work? This is a double standard. People respect traditional metrics that they don't understand how they work. But for example, when something is new and alien to somebody, they really want to know what's going on. They want to know, where does this data come from? Like, when you propose an H-index, somebody maybe doesn't know what's in Web of Science, but they don't really care. But they want to know, how does this work? How does an API work? And without being able to confidently answer those questions, you're basically immediately nixing the possibility that this person is going to feel confident using this. And obviously, there's a double standard. Because of extreme variations in citation patterns and in publishing patterns from discipline to discipline, there's pretty extreme variation in what's considered good on the traditional metric side. But there's some trust in seniority and in your senior colleagues and in your department heads to know that. And some of the most popular tools for calculating citation-based metrics will provide widely different results. But that's something that isn't cared about as much as when you introduce a new tool. So without an established, respected faculty champion and really solid answers to these questions, a promotion and tenure committee doesn't feel really confident adopting something they don't really understand. And if a researcher is, for example, in need of a really easily digestible alternative metric to balance her dossier for promotion and tenure, educational barriers are parts of on her part or on the part of those reviewing that dossier are ultimately going to prove really problematic. So in addition, there's a lot of technical barriers. We obviously have great tools that measure a lot of stuff, but there are technical barriers that prevent these tools from being useful for everybody. I think a lot of people here today are really working hard to develop tools that accommodate some of these technological barriers. I think we've heard a lot about some really interesting and innovative stuff over the past couple of days. So though we have excellent tools and we are developing even more excellent tools, there's still a huge number of things that really aren't captured. So when you go to somebody and you say they're interested in measuring something that citation doesn't measure, that's not always something that we can measure using social media, even though that is our easiest to data source. I was once approached by a promotion and tenure committee in the poultry science department at North Carolina State University. A PhD candidate of theirs had attended a library workshop on altmetrics and was really, really excited about it. And the department wanted to hear more about the prospect of integrating some of this data into their standard promotion and tenure dossier. And I was like so excited, because when does a P&T committee ever come to a librarian to say, like, we really want to use something cool and new? But the department wanted it because this department had a lot of people doing agricultural extension work. They were writing papers that were turning into reports that were going out to farmers, and they were becoming best practices in poultry, like raising chickens, essentially. And we didn't have anything that could actually measure that for them, and we couldn't provide them with a good tool. And ultimately, they decided against adopting. Additionally, we have technical issues with existing metrics. We're working on metadata standardization. Items without standard identifiers, like DOIs, I know this has been mentioned, can't be easily captured. And there's a really deep need for sentiment analysis. All of these things have really been covered today. But as Ali mentioned, utility is a major factor in the adoption of altmetrics, and technical utility is a huge part of that. And finally, there are the cultural barriers. we've talked a little bit about this, but we're at the tail ends of early adoption. We've got a lot of people that are really excited about this, but we're still early adopters. And there's hesitance around cultural values that affect the perceived value of altmetric data. But we've got major granting agencies that have established values for broader impacts. There are disciplinary, institutional, and departmental and cultural values that are at play that hinder widespread adoption. The tides are changing, but we still have not conquered the idea that the scholarly conversation happens only one way, and that way is through publication. And that's a really difficult barrier for us to address. So when we go into a conversation with early career scholars, as much as we want to tell them there are lots of ways you can have the scholarly conversation, there's a lot you can do between 0 publications and 1 publication to be talking about your research. There are a lot of venues that you can talk about your research. When somebody who is senior who's telling them to publish in a high-impact journal and measure their impact with the H-index is someone they respect, it's really hard to conquer that. So this is just early steps of an idea that we had to sort of think about why people don't use these tools in a different way other than related to reward structures. And we wanted to try to apply these different barriers at an advocacy level and also at a development level by moving away from the push towards public good and by addressing the user-centered roots of these problems. We can become more effective advocates for widespread adoption, and we are really interested in hearing your feedback. And that's 13 minutes and 28 seconds. So.
I have one. Who do you think your best partners are in helping to spread the word about, it sounds like you're really on the ground, you've identified these 3 core areas that are stopping the use of these kinds of metrics. Who are your best partners in this community? Is it the publishers? Is it the Altmetrics data providers? Is it institutions? Who do you need help from?
No, that's like the $1 million question. Yeah, that's really hard because a lot of the things that we talked about kind of hit on all of those points. I mean, I think that there's definitely a role in terms of the altmetric data providers and library and information science folk too, in terms of making sure that the metadata and standardization of both these platforms and of the kind of objects that we're analyzing, whether they be tweets or ISBNs or the like, are all kind of working together under some sort of like standardized model. And of course, I think probably that needs to be in place for people to kind of see that there is value in this. But I think probably the most crucial partners are established faculty members. I think that there's often a very strong push on graduate students and early career people to really be the people that transform scholarly communication. And I think that's exceptionally unfair because those people are coming through a system that is broken and doesn't work, and they don't necessarily have the job security or the confidence or any number of other things kind of required to do that. So I think what we really need is to find champions who are well established in their career, that will kind of act as the champions to talk to their colleagues. And those are the people on the tenure and promotion committees. Those are the people that can start that conversation about the ways impact can look. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'd also just like to add that all of the groups that you identified, it's just about having lines of communication from people that are on the ground to people that are creating the things that, like I don't have the technical skills to really dig into this and to make a metric that measures agricultural extension and chicken farming. But if we had, you know, we're here today because it's a great place to start that conversation around people who are really pushing hard and knocking down doors to get people to change the way we have the scholarly conversation, and people that are making things that do change the way that we have the scholarly conversation.
Yep, just run up to the mic there if you can.
Excellent talk. I wonder if you think that there are certain findings or certain lines of research that would help you. So for instance, if you could show that, like Rodrigo's, where people who are on Twitter are more highly cited in general, or maybe I think one that could be really neat would be to show that, for instance, better universities, or you know, in the Times Higher Education, most of those universities are using Altmetrics, so probably we should as well, or you know, some research finding along that you can like take this paper to the people that you're working with and be like, yo, this is something that needs to be done.
Yeah, so I constantly hear from promotion and tenure committees that if someone else was doing it, that they would do it. But we don't have sort of a comprehensive corpus of research on people that have universities that have really embraced this and the effect that that has. I don't know if Al, you have anything to add to that? No, that's good. And Juan has something to add to that.
Yeah, just a quick plug to, I have a project where I'm studying review, tenure, and promotion guidelines in the US and Canada, where we grabbed the review, tenure, and promotion guidelines from 130 or something universities, and then we got department guidelines from we managed to get them for about 60 universities. And we have been looking at which ones mention alternative outputs and public scholarship and open access. And if you would like to know a bit about what we found, you can go to our scalcomlab.ca and sign up for our mailing list.
And we are eagerly awaiting the results of that.
We have some results. I just haven't actually, you can come talk to me, I'll give you like a bit of the summary, but we haven't, I just have like preliminary outputs. It is not very encouraging, that I'll give you, in case anyone, I don't see anybody's face of shock all of a sudden, but open access was mentioned 4 times or 5 times, I think. Only 1 time in a positive context.
But just a small comment, actually I think it would be a really awesome project for those on the Altmetric team, just to take the list of, for instance, people who buy Altmetrics, and then compare it with the Times Higher Education list, and then just show like 8 of the top 10 universities by Times Higher Education are using Altmetrics. The rest of you should do it as well. I mean, I think that would be really cool. Yeah.
I lied. I did actually have something to add to this too, which is basically, I think that data is, of course, very useful and important, but I still think, like, can't count the number of times where I've given a talk on open access and I can, like, point to all of these, like, great articles that have been written that prove that things that are open access have higher citation counts, and I'm working with scientists, so people who theoretically should respond to data and facts, and yet still, when I'm having these conversations, especially at a wider scale, it seems like you can give the data, you can give the facts, but really until one of their colleagues is like, yeah, I'm on Twitter and it's working out pretty well for me, you know. And maybe that colleague will give them, maybe they'll point them to the same paper that I gave them, and they'll respond, because I think that there is that, even though librarians are partners in the research process, and even if we are in a faculty association, our requirements for tenure and promotion are different. And so I think that that is an important thing to remember when we're doing our advocacy work, that yes, we can absolutely start that conversation, but I really think that a lot of the conversations also need to happen within departments.
One last question, then we'll wrap up.
Sorry. I have a question, but also a quick comment. American Anthropology Association just released new guidelines for tenure and promotion, which include in them recognition of use of social media. So my question is in reaction to the point that you're saying, the idea that the real scholarly conversation happens in monographs. And I think that's a really important point to take home, is that we tend to think of altmetrics as very short tail kinds of things that we're analyzing. And for people in the humanities, it's a very long tail time span that they're thinking of. And so if a book isn't picked up until 10 years later, that's not a problem, right? And we're not recognizing that need, and where are we coming up with the metrics for doing that kind of long tail tracking? And that's just the question, is what can we do for that?
I think that's a great question, and I will say that I was in an anthropology professional development class the other day, and they were pushing back very, very hard on Altmetrics because of the types of materials that they were working with they didn't feel were appropriate to share in an immediate setting and in a conversation. And I wish I had an answer for how the conversation around alternative metrics or alternative ways of measuring research impact is so focused on social media and immediacy, but that obviously doesn't work for all disciplines, especially the humanities. And I think that's why it's great to have people doing work like the Humetrics folks are doing, that are trying to find ways that value things that are a little longer term or are a little bit different than just immediate output. And then Ali, I don't know if you have to, I want to give you a chance.
I didn't have anything to add to that. I just wanted to say that we would really love to hear all of your thoughts, your questions, your concerns, anything that we'd said, any hot takes that you have. Please come find us during the coffee break or some other time during the rest of the day, because we would love to chat more about this stuff.
And thank you for the segue, because it's now time for the coffee break. Thank you very much to all the presenters. We'll see you back here in about 10 minutes.